So in this video, we're going to be talking about the Blackmagic Design Ursa Mini Pro G2. Now just a disclaimer, nobody paid me to review this item. I paid this camera out of my own pocket, so I am not affiliated with any of these companies. I am reviewing this camera as a consumer just like you. So let's go ahead and talk about the pros of the Ursa Mini Pro G2. Now, the first thing that I really like about this camera is the dynamic range. When shooting outdoors, I really don't have to worry about clipping anything because this camera is truly amazing as far as dynamic range goes. Now, I didn't really do scientific tests per se, but I'm telling you right now, it's very, very hard to clip anything with this camera. Now, if you absolutely just do it for fun, clip something because you wanted to, then you will clip it. But if you expose properly or even close to properly, you're gonna get great image coming out of this camera because the dynamic range is truly amazing. That being said, the next thing we're gonna talk about is color science. Now, the Pro G2 has the Generation 4 color science from the Blackmagic Design. Now, their first sensor, the Fairchild sensor, was really good and people really fell in love with it. And after that, they went kind of like whatever. But Generation 4, I can tell you right now, this color science is truly amazing. I don't know about you, but for me, I really like that naturalistic look, especially with skin tones and skies and grass. So Generation 4 is really, really good when it comes to that. The next thing I like about this camera is the built-in ND filter. With this camera, you don't have to lug around ND filters, whether that's a square filter or a round filter. It's pretty nice just having the actual ND filters built in your camera. Now, the camera has 6 stops, 4 stops, 2 stops, and then 0, which is none, which is plenty enough for me. 99% of the ND filter I use is the 1.2 or 4 stops. So the next thing I like about this camera, I don't necessarily need, but it's kind of just nice to have. It's the 120 frames per second at 4.6K. Just keep in mind that when shooting this speed with the SSD T5 Samsung that I have, you're gonna have to switch your quality down to Q5 instead of Q0 because the Q0 will drop your frames. I think it only lasted 5 seconds before it dropped the frames. So if you are planning on shooting 4.6K 120 frames per second, just make sure that you're aware that you're gonna have to drop that quality down to Q5. Next thing that I like about this camera is the Usbc recording, just because the fact that the SSD drives are way cheaper than CFast 2.0 cards as of right now. Actually, I don't know about the future. The next thing I like about this camera is the Anamorphic Mode. It actually has a proper Anamorphic Mode, which is amazing. Additionally, with that, next thing I like about it is the Anamorphic De-Squeeze. It can de-squeeze your footage to 1.33 or 2 times stretch, which is nice because you don't have to buy an external monitor just to see what you're shooting in the Anamorphic setup. I absolutely love that the LCD screen has the squeeze option because it will save you money and it will save you time. The next thing I like about this camera are the buttons. There's a crap ton of them, and that's because it's supposed to be an ENG style cinematic hybrid camera, which I absolutely love. Although most of the buttons actually just repeat, pretty much just multiple buttons everywhere. There's buttons up front, inside the camera, on the back of the screen. There's just buttons galore. If you like buttons and you like pressing things, this camera you're definitely gonna like. So the next thing I like about this camera is, I would say, low light capability. Now, when I say low light capability, I'm not talking about full frame Sony cameras or Gemini. I'm talking about just low light capabilities with actual light in it. I can safely say that this camera, as far as ISO 3200 goes, because that's the highest I would go with this camera, is much better than the original Ursa Mini 4.6K. To me, I think the noise is pretty acceptable at 3200 ISO. It is much cleaner than the original Ursa Mini 4.6K. So yeah, ISO 3200 I absolutely like. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the rolling shutter. Now, the rolling shutter for this camera is pretty decent. I'm not gonna say it's a global shutter, but the rolling shutter is in between a DSLR and a global shutter. It's just right in the middle. It's not too dizzying, if you know what I'm talking about. It's pretty decent. All right, the next thing we're gonna talk about is the menu. Now, I am a little bit biased about this, but if you're a new Blackmagic Design user and the Ursa Mini Pro G2 is your first camera, it's not gonna take you that long to pretty much learn where everything is. It's really simple. It's not a menu within a menu. This is a couple of pages of settings, and that's pretty much it. All right, so the next thing we're gonna talk about is the weight and size. I know what you're thinking, this thing is massive, but if you think about the stuff that it can do for the size, it's really not that bad. If you compare this to a Red camera or an Arri Alexa, the size of the Ursa Mini Pro G2 is really not that terrifying. So the last thing I like about the G2 is the interchangeable lens mount. As you all know, most of the lens companies out there that rent lenses or professional lenses only have PL mount lenses, especially the anamorphic ones. So if you want a camera that's future-proof, the interchangeable lens system of the G2 is definitely an amazing thing for you. So now that we talked about all the good things about this camera, we're gonna talk about the bad things. Now the first thing that I don't like about this camera is unfortunately it has that red clipping similar to the Pocket 4K. Now it's not as bad as the Pocket 4K red clipping, but it's still there, especially on brake lights and whatnot, as you can see in this example. So yeah, that's kind of annoying. I don't know if you're gonna be able to fix this in a future firmware, but I just like to let you guys know that it is there. So the next thing I don't like about this camera is it doesn't come with a handle. The Ursa Mini 4.6K came with a handle, so I'm not sure what happened because yeah, without the handle, this thing is pretty crazy, which brings us to the next thing I don't like about this camera. It is not very ergonomic. If you're looking at this camera, you literally have to carry it like this, like a football, because it doesn't have the handle. So keep that in mind. If you are planning on getting this camera, make sure you save some money to get some accessories like handles, because straight out of the box, it is not very ergonomic friendly. Next thing I don't like about this camera are some of the button placements. The first button I'm going to talk about is the aperture button. Now I don't like it because if I'm using the LCD screen and I tilt it just a little bit, you are not going to be able to change the aperture on this little button they have right behind the LCD screen. It's a pretty bad placement right there. I would suggest you guys move it next time. And the second thing that I don't like about it as far as buttons goes is the record button. The record button is pretty hard to find. There are two buttons, I believe, if you don't have the controller. Now most of the time I end up pressing the high frame rate button because it's pretty close to the record button. And so when I'm playing something back, I'm actually recording in 48 frames per second instead of 24, which is freaking annoying. So next time, Blackmagic Design, just gotta think about where you're putting these buttons. Speaking of placements, the next thing I don't like about this camera is the headphone jack. The headphone jack is behind the camera, right beside the XLR, power XLR cable. If you have an XLR cable like me, which is like right angled, it's gonna block the headphone jack, as you can see here what I'm showing you. So that's pretty annoying. Again, if you can move the headphone jack somewhere else, please do so. All right, so with all the Blackmagic Design cameras, there are cameras out there that have bugs. I've already seen people with ProRes bugs, a lot of bugs, but I think for me, I got pretty lucky. All right, so a couple of things to talk about before I sign out. First things first, before you record something, go ahead and calibrate your sensor. You're supposed to calibrate it whenever the temperature changes or whenever you do a firmware update. Go ahead and calibrate it, because if not, you're gonna run into issues. I ran into a couple of them, but they weren't too bad. One of them is the shadows and some of my footage were really blue, and that's because I didn't calibrate it properly. So what I ended up doing was just calibrating it 3 times, and that fixed the problem, I think. I didn't have any more blue shadows. But yeah, so it's not a perfect camera. I don't think there's a perfect camera out there that comes out straight out of the bat. And you know, Blackmagic Design, they always have issues. So who is this camera for? So in my opinion, this camera is for professionals or high-end YouTubers out there. Just keep in mind, don't think that this camera is gonna beat out some low light king out there or a dual native sensor ISO camera out there in low light. It's just not gonna happen. It is still a cinema camera. That means you're gonna have to light things with it. Even though the ISO 3200 is decent enough, in my opinion, you can't expect this camera to beat out a Gemini or something like that. I am actually thinking about comparing this to a Scarlett weapon. We'll see how that goes, but I think it would be a good matchup, the red Scarlett weapon and the Blackmagic Ursa Mini Pro G2. If you guys have any questions, let me know, and I obviously have a lot more tests to do. I'll see you guys later.